Welcome everybody to a look at a limited edition Steelbook release from HMV. It's on Blu-ray. It's part of their Japanese artwork series that came out in 2020, and it is 1975's The Hindenburg. So yeah, being Japanese artwork, it does have the title in Japanese. Same with the side as well, and then we have different artwork on the reverse on top of that. So yeah, very nice looking steelbook overall. But the film itself was directed by Robert Wise, who I've seen 10 other films from. Favourites being the likes of The Haunting, The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Andromeda Strain, The Setup, and The Body Snatcher. And this is a disaster thriller clocking in at 125 minutes long. Stars likes of George C. Scott, who I've seen in 12 other films. Absolute favourites would be like Anatomy of a Murder, The Exorcist 3, The Changeling. But this does match the likes of The List of Adrian Messenger, The New Centurions, and Firestarter. We've also got Anne Bancroft, who was in Nightfall, The Pumpkin Eater, The Slender Thread, and Malice, also alongside Scott, as well as William Atherton, who was in the first two Die Hard films, as well as Ghostbusters, The Sugarland Express, and The New Centurions, also alongside Scott. So Colonel Franz Ritter, a former hero pilot now working for military intelligence, is assigned to the Great Hindenburg airship as its chief of security. As he races against the clock to uncover a possible saboteur aboard the doomed Zeppelin, he finds that any of the passengers and crew could be the culprit. So, although this isn't without its issues, chiefly the pacing that makes the runtime somewhat feel its length. But that said, I have never been bored by watching this, while also being wholly engrossed despite knowing how it ends, because, you know, the Hindenburg disaster, alongside probably likes of Titanic, are probably two of the most well-known disasters pre-World War Two. And yeah, one reason for that is the fact that the disaster was actually filmed. Um, so yeah, for the reason for it being as engrossing as it is that despite being based on a horrific real-life event, it inserts fictional elements so as to give the film the legs necessary to get it to feature length. As the disaster itself that occurred on the Hindenburg lasted less than a minute, so to make a full-length film out of that was clearly going to be a big task, which ultimately I feel like it mostly pulls off. Unlike, say, something like Sully, which I don't think really needed a full-length feature film for that. And you can tell that they were struggling for ideas by trying to make out that the NTSB were antagonistic towards Sully, the pilot of the Hudson on the River, the Miracle. So yeah, but yeah, it mostly pulls it off thanks to a really good performance from George C. Scott, whose character is given not just an effective amount of depth, but is also the most interesting overall, as he is wholly conflicted between his loyalty to a regime and his own personal loss, also thanks to said regime. The rest of the cast is solid, as typical with a disaster film from the 70s. You do have numerous cast members, obviously the three that I've mentioned, but you also have the likes of Burgess Meredith in there as well. So even though it's not the strongest cast of any disaster film from this period, it's hardly the weakest either. The cinematography is great, the special effects still hold up, the score is solid, and the production of the interior of the airship and its model, which is actually something that still exists to this day, I think it's in a museum somewhere in America, are all entirely convincing. The finale, however, is where this film shines, as it is not just tense despite knowing the ultimate outcome, but the disaster itself is shown with the famous newsreel footage interwoven with vignettes of the fictional characters inside attempting to escape. So because obviously the newsreel footage is so vivid and such a clear depiction of what actually happened outside of the initial start of where the fire occurred, it would make no sense for them to recreate that in the studio or try and recreate that. I don't think it would have worked at all really if they had tried to recreate that, because ultimately, like I said, we know the footage is available, so why not use it? But because obviously it is in black and white, that meant that the film footage of the fictional elements that were not being able to show, you know, the interiors of the ship, what was happening to certain people at that time, they had to be recreated. So therefore, that part also had to be in black and white. And to achieve this, when the explosion does happen, you get this massive burst of color, and then it cuts to black and white, and that's how the rest of the film then plays out. And I think that's a really, really well done way of doing it, and it's, for my money, done in a respectful and effective manner overall. So yeah, it's really, really well done, to be honest. And yeah, it's really, really horrifying still seeing that newsreel footage after all. You're seeing this 804-foot long airship, the biggest, longest aircraft ever made, just coming down in this massive fireball because you've got several million cubic feet of hydrogen just going up like a spark, and it's just, yeah, it's absolutely horrific. You also have the guy that was commentating on the Hindenburg coming in. He's also has his commentary at times as well, and yeah, it's just a horrific sight. But somehow most people actually got out of this. I think it was 35 that died, but 62 survived. So yeah, it's an incredible fact that so many people actually did survive, and obviously that comes down to the fact that it wasn't a fast airship in terms of coming into land. It's not like an aircraft that's coming into land on a runway or anything like that, which is doing about 100 150 mile an hour, whatever. This is obviously coming in quite slowly, and it slowly came down. It wasn't a quick drop into the ground, and by the time the gondolas underneath came towards the ground, they were low enough that people could jump off, and most people did survive by doing that. So yeah, it's an horrific event, but it is one that I think is told in a decent enough manner. Now, granted, whether or not the ship itself actually did get destroyed by a saboteur, as the film depicts, is another thing entirely. There's so many hypotheses out there about what destroyed it. Was it structural failure? Was it a lightning? Was it static electricity? Saboteur? Some people thought it was an engine explosion. It could have been anything really. It's still not really been fully determined, but I still think overall that the film does a good job of bringing its own hypothesis to the fore. Little bit of a shame though that in terms of the actual Blu-ray, it's not the greatest. It's only 2.0 stereo mix, and it doesn't look like any restoration has actually gone on. That is a real photo of the Hindenburg going over New York before it actually was destroyed. And there are no extras at all on the disc outside of subtitles. So yeah, it's very limited in terms of that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, it's just a really, really nice steelbook that I've shown, obviously. And on top of that, we got what I think is called a Shinari poster, which is the kind of one that was shown in like Japanese cinemas. So it's quite thin but quite long, and yeah, got the artwork there that we've seen on the steelbook. So yeah, this was one of 8 films that HMV released as part of the Japanese artwork series. They also did Jaws, Duel, The Thing, Back to the Future, The Hard Way, Spartacus, and The Great Wall. Jaws, Back to the Future, Spartacus, and The Great Wall were all released on 4K, and the rest were released on Blu-ray, like the Hindenburg. And yeah, the only other one I got was Duel, because I actually hadn't had that on Blu-ray before until they were released. So that's the only other one I got. But yeah, you can still find them all out there, readily available. I think they made 1,200 or 1,500 of these. So there weren't massive amounts of them, but still plenty enough to find on third-party sellers. So yeah, and I do highly recommend getting the likes of this, which I do believe didn't have a Blu-ray release in the UK before this series came out. I do believe every other film in there though had a Blu-ray release at the very least, if not a 4K already. So yeah, the rest of them weren't all that special in that regard, but they do all look good in terms of their artwork on the steelbooks. And yeah, this is one of my favourites. It's a highly underrated disaster film from the 70s, which was obviously the heyday of that kind of genre. Not my favourite from that period, granted. That's a Towering Inferno, Poseidon Adventure, I would say are better. But this perhaps third place or thereabouts. So yeah, well worth seeing if you haven't already. Just go in mind knowing that you are going to see real newsreel footage of the disaster itself. I think it was actually the first disaster that was actually filmed on camera, in fact. So yeah, that's one reason why airships became, instantly unfavourable. It's because it was such a, widely publicised thing. The famous photos of the ship up in the air with the fire shooting out of the nose and such like that. It was just such a dramatic event that was so well publicised that, yeah, the airship was never going to survive. And in fairness, you could say that it wasn't entirely the fault of, the engineers or whatnot of the Hindenburg themselves, because if the US hadn't put a big embargo on any helium being exported, then this wouldn't have happened. The ship might not have been as big or as luxurious as it was, because the only reason that it was able to be as big as it was because hydrogen is lighter than helium, but helium still provides enough lift So they would have redesigned it, but yeah, ultimately the lack of helium being exported is what made them use hydrogen. And even though they went to every extreme length as possible, as shown in the film, you know, they only had a one lighter on the ship for smoking, and even then that was in one dedicated smoking room that you couldn't smoke anywhere else in. And then, you know, it just shows all sorts of intricacies of the interior as well, which is all really well detailed. But if it was structural failure, you can entirely see why it was never noticed. There's so many wires, so many cross beams, such a large ship. You know, this airship at the end of the day was only 79 feet shorter than the Titanic or thereabouts, and yet, you know, it could do 76 mile an hour cruising speed, 85 top speed, get across the Atlantic in no time at all compared to any ship, and yet you can fully see why, you know, not being able to find weaknesses in the design or weaknesses after using it several times over would go unnoticed. And yeah, structural failure does seem like they like the outcome. It even hints at that in one scene in this where a wire is accidentally let loose and it flies off and severs part of the fabric on the outer skin of the ship. So if it can do that to the outer skin, it could easily have done that to one of the gas bags, and therefore let hydrogen out, and just one spark would have been all it would have taken to have taken it down. So yeah, but still, really, really good film. 4 out of 5. Well worth seeing if you haven't already. But if you have, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.